Hello, and we're continuing our study in the book of Ruth, and tonight we'll be in Ruth 3. But previously on Ruth, there was a famine throughout the land, and Elimelech, Naomi, and their kids ended up leaving because of the famine. Right? So they traveled from Bethlehem and went all the way over to Moab. And then there in Moab, frail and weak, their children got married, Elimelech died, and then their children both ended up dying. So Naomi, with her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, they ended up heading back. But along the way, Naomi told Ruth and Orpah to go back to Moab, and they argued with Naomi. Eventually, Orpah agreed to leave, but Ruth clung to Naomi. And Ruth then famously said, "Do not persuade me to leave you or go back and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May Yahweh punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you from me." And this is, of course, one of the great declarations of faith in the Old Testament. So Naomi agrees to let Ruth go with her. They end up back in Bethlehem, where Naomi, in her grief and bitterness, famously says, "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made me bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has pronounced judgment on me and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So then chapter 1 ends, of course, with they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So the next chapter begins with the introduction of Boaz, a kinsman of Elimelech's. Ruth then, according to the gleaning laws, goes to scrounge for food on the fringes of the fields that are being harvested, where she just randomly wanders onto Elimelech's field. There, Elimelech finds her and realizes that she's the one who's taking care of Naomi. So he makes sure that not only is she able to have access to all the food she needs, but she's given all kinds of privileges and special care. And on the first day or thereabouts, she leaves with roughly 6.5 gallons of food plus a doggy bag. You can see my little pun there. Right, because she's invited to eat with the workers, which seems kind of odd. And then not only that, but she's allowed to take food back with her in addition to whatever she's collected. So then she wanders back to Naomi, where she said to her, "Where did you gather barley today, and where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." Because Naomi realizes, right, that this is not normal, whatever has happened, that the only way she could have gathered this amount of food is if someone was helping her. So Ruth tells Naomi, "Well, I was working at this guy named Boaz's field," and Naomi realizes, "Oh, we know Boaz because he's a relative of ours," and she's like, "Just do whatever Boaz tells you to do," right? So at the end of chapter 2, it says, Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So they get back to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest. This would be sometime around April or June, and it says that she's staying with Naomi, taking care of her, and going out gathering food through the entirety of the harvest season, which would put us somewhere end of October, early November. So around this time of year, actually. So 6-7 months or so. And then we begin chapter 3. And chapter 3 of Ruth is one of the more infamous chapters in the Old Testament for a couple of reasons. Many have trouble even starting on how to teach it because of various problems with the chapter. It's very heavily sexually charged. That's the issue. If you haven't read it or are just completely oblivious to the problem. I remember my father used to say that if you removed all the sex and violence from the Bible, there'd be almost nothing left. And he's not entirely wrong. There's a lot of it. And this chapter is a good example of it. So last time we had a word of the day, right? And this time we also have a word of the day. The word of the day is innuendo, where you can have something that's heavily implied to the point where you don't even need to say it or have it explicitly referenced because of how strongly it's implied. Movies, at least I used to remember when movies would say like PG-13, it'd be for mild violence and innuendo. And by that they mean usually that sex is implied without being overtly shown or stated. And that's part of the fun of this chapter. I say fun because there's a lot of implication. And because it's implied, that leaves us open to interpretation. And this is where various commentaries and theologians and so forth have argued over the meaning of this chapter. That said, Ruth 3 and 4 are two of my favorite chapters in the Bible. And I'm not being facetious. I absolutely love these chapters. I love this book. So be patient with me, and I think you'll enjoy where we end up. So in one commentary, actually it's Dr. Chisholm's commentary, who teaches over at DTS, he calls this chapter Matchmaker, Matchmaker, from the famous line from Fiddler on the Roof, right? Matchmaker, Matchmaker, find me a match. I know I'm musicals, which I'm not sure I should be proud of. But yeah, so that should give you a sense of where we are in this chapter and what's going on in this chapter. So verse 1 begins, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, shouldn't I find security for you so that you will be taken care of?" Now, again, Ruth has been providing for Naomi now for 6 months or more. And during that time, now remember, at the beginning of when they arrive back into Bethlehem, Naomi's bitter, she's mad, she's not particularly happy about the fact that Ruth has tagged along. And she's been trying to get rid of Ruth this whole time. And so we find out that Naomi's been making a plan. She's been rather devious in the amount of time that she's had. And she is grateful to Ruth to a certain point. And at this, now that Ruth has taken care of her, she wants to make sure that Ruth is going to be provided for. And we also get a glimpse into she doesn't really care all that much about what happens to her. That's going to be part of the tension of this chapter. And in verse 2, "Now isn't Boaz our relative? Haven't you been working with his female servants?" We know from chapter 2 that Ruth has been given permission to work alongside Boaz's workers, and that she's been instructed to stay with the female workers, not to venture off with the men, and that she's been given access to areas that she probably wouldn't normally be allowed to. And Naomi's been around the block. Naomi's not an idiot. And Naomi knows that Boaz is showing Ruth attention that he probably wouldn't normally show to some random woman who's wandered onto the fields. And she's interpreting this as Boaz has his eye on Ruth, and his intentions may not be completely honorable. And Naomi wants Ruth to take advantage of that. And I mean take advantage of that. So I think that Naomi, I'm going to get them mixed up all night. I think that Naomi is not being entirely fair to Boaz as we go through this chapter. But still, this is how Naomi is interpreting Boaz's advancements, that this is purely, he's interested in Ruth, and he's doing all of this just to gain Ruth's favor. And so Naomi wants Ruth to capitalize on that. So what's going to follow is Naomi's 4-step guide for getting a man. And we are going to see her plan essentially unfold. So she begins by saying, this evening, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Okay, so we know where he's going to be, which is a good step in the plan, right? And we know what he's going to be doing. So this gives us, since we have opportunity, this allows us to go about unfolding our master plan. So in case you haven't fully understood or can't completely visualize what a winnowing is, what you do is you take the stalks of grain, barley, or whatever, and you throw it in the air. And the idea is when a breeze comes by, it takes away all the worthless stuff and leaves behind the seeds. And you keep doing this until all the chaff and the stalks and all the bad stuff is gone, and you just keep, filtering it over and over and over again until all you have is the grain. So this is what Boaz is going to be doing all day and presumably all evening, just so you have that in your mind. So, step one is wash. Hygiene is important, especially when you're going on a date. This is just good general advice. But it's clearly not just washing, right? There's anticipation for this washing. In many cultures, washing is tied to the marriage ritual, and not just the marriage ritual. There's a really funny scene. One of my favorite movies growing up was the movie Stargate with, Kurt Russell, I think and James Spader. Well, there's a scene where Daniel Jackson, who's the James Spader character, they've stumbled upon this ancient Egyptian culture, and at some point they're having a meal with these people, and they don't completely understand what's happening. Well, these older women abduct James Spader and take him into a tent and start cleaning him and trying to bathe him. And he finally has to fight them off and shoo him out of the tent. What he doesn't realize is at some point during the evening, he had been married off to one of the daughters of the elders. And they're preparing him for the marriage evening. And, of course, when that comes out, he kind of freaks out and doesn't know what to do about it. In many cultures, there's something called the bridal bath, where you're getting ready for essentially the bridal night. Again, we have a pun. I thought that was really clever. But we'll see that there's multiple implications for this, not just marriage. So then she says, step 2, put on perfume, oil, wear your best clothes. And this, again, has different implications. We have marriage imagery tied with the bathing, with the dressing up, putting on the oil, putting on your best stuff. But we also have seduction imagery. Right? You're doing all of this for the purpose of wooing a man, and not necessarily in a positive way. And because we have this blending of imagery with what exactly is Naomi's intention, that's where the ambiguity in this chapter lies. So what exactly is Ruth trying to do? Or what is it that Naomi wants Ruth to do? And it gets increasingly more questionable as we go on. So step 3 is go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. So keep tabs on him and don't let anyone else know that you're there. So you're kind of stalking him, which seems less than honorable. This is literally the best picture I could find of a woman stalking. And then 4, when he lies down, notice the place where he's lying down, go in and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do. So, so this is step 4. And what exactly is Naomi suggesting here? Well, it's true that very often men can be rather slow. They aren't always best on picking up on what women are implying. And so, how does Boaz know that Ruth is interested? How does he know that she's making advancements towards him? Well, sneaking into his bed, sneaking into where he's sleeping is a pretty decent indication that she might be interested. And that does seem to be what Naomi is hinting at. So you get cleaned up, you put on your nice clothes, you find out where he is, keep tabs on him, and then sneak into wherever he's sleeping. There's something known as, we make a distinction often between description versus prescription. So just because something is described in the Bible doesn't necessarily mean that's what we should do. But we're going to keep going. Now, we get this phrase, to uncover the feet, and this is one of the many phrases in this chapter that there's a lot of debate over, which adds to the ambiguity of this chapter. And the first possible meaning is to uncover starting at the feet. That is, you sneak into wherever he's sleeping, and you start to undress him. Now, he's wearing some kind of robe, right? So you would naturally have to pull it up from the bottom. And you just see where the evening takes you, basically. Some commentaries very much have their minds in the gutter. But to be fair, the chapter has very sexually charged imagery and language. The next interpretation, which isn't a whole lot better, is to uncover yourself at his feet. So you go to where he is sleeping, and you're standing at the foot of whatever, and then you undress yourself. Again, he's probably going to get the idea, right? Whether or not you're undressing him or you're undressing yourself, the fact is you're a girl sneaking into a guy's tent. He's going to assume some things. The other interpretations are a little less overt, a little more innocent perhaps, this is some sort of ancient custom that we just don't fully understand. So there's the argument that this is just a way of getting his attention. So he's laying down, just minding his own business. You sneak in. He doesn't notice you're there. So you pull the blanket or whatever off his feet to get his attention. Because if someone sneaks into your bedroom and tugs on the covers, you're going to notice. It'd be hard not to notice. And then the fourth one is that this is a fairly innocent gesture that would be done by servants, that there wasn't necessarily anything untoward about a servant or a slave laying at the feet of their master. I don't know how much evidence there is for this, so that a servant or whatever could go and lay at their master's feet, and there wouldn't be any immediate implication one way or the other. Some commentaries, especially older commentaries, may go with this. Again, I don't know what the defense is of it. The point seems to be, regardless of how uncomfortable it may make us, that this is sexual language, that Naomi is, well, we'll get to that. So, why is Naomi doing this? Right? What is Naomi's desire? And, well, just rip off the Band-Aid, right? Naomi is embracing her inner pimp. She is intentionally trying to get Ruth to seduce Boaz. That's what Naomi wants her to do. And you can go, why? Why is Naomi doing this? Well, there are in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy various rape laws. And I'm going somewhere with this. So, for example, in Exodus 22:16, you have, if a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and he has sexual relations with her, he must certainly pay the bridal price for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must pay an amount in silver equal to the bridal price for virgins. So there are other laws as well. If you seduce a woman who's already married, that's usually results in death. If the woman doesn't cry rape, then they can both be killed. There's all kinds of laws. But this law gets a lot of attention because if a man takes advantage of a young girl who's not married or just engaged, then, and what people get away from this is, well, he's just forced to marry her. How is that fair to the woman? Well, you're not reading the whole thing. The context of it is, by taking advantage of this young girl, you've basically ruined her life. Right? The chances of her finding an honorable husband is very low now. She's no longer a virgin. And if she ends up pregnant, you get into all kinds of custody, legal laws, and all kinds of problems. This is true of pretty much every ancient law code. So you have two options. One, you are forced to marry her. And what that basically means is you have to take care of her for the rest of her life. Not only are you forced to marry her, you're not allowed to divorce her. So you're stuck with her. Even if she turns out to be a bad wife, you can't abandon her. You have to take care of her, take care of her kids. And now, but if you're like, well, but that's just not fair because you're forcing this girl into marriage. Well, no, it actually says, if the family says no, they don't have to give her to her. But you still have to pay the bride price because, an honorable family isn't going to want to pay for her anymore because she's already been attacked. It's unfortunate, but this is the fairest way that they would have dealt with it back then. In Deuteronomy 22, we have a similar situation. If the man encounters an engaged woman in the open field and seizes her and rapes her, only the man who raped her must die. Do nothing to the young woman because she is not guilty of an offense deserving death. This case is just like one in which a man attacks his neighbor and murders him. When he found her in the field, the engaged woman cried out, but there was no one to rescue her. If a man encounters a young woman, a virgin who is not engaged, takes hold of her and rapes her, they are discovered. The man who raped her must give the young woman's father 50 shekels, and she must become his wife because he violated her. He cannot divorce her as long as he lives. But to be fair, Ruth falls into an interesting sort of loophole, right? Because she's not a virgin, but she's also not married. But here's how I think Naomi's plan is supposed to work out. Ruth does everything that Naomi tells her to. She then sneaks into wherever Boaz is sleeping. Boaz is then so overwhelmed by her womanly wiles that he has to give in because he's a useless, dumb man, right? And he has no self-control. And after whatever happens, Boaz will then be so overcome, because if he is an honorable person, right, as the text wants us to believe, and as Naomi seems to think he is, he would then feel compelled to marry her, right? Which is what Naomi and Ruth want. They want Boaz to marry Ruth. That way, Ruth is going to be taken care of. She'll be provided for, she'll probably have more kids, they'll be well off because we know Boaz is a wealthy, respected businessman. And we would basically have a shotgun wedding of convenience. Boaz, having taken advantage of Ruth, although Ruth putting him in that situation, Boaz is like, oh no, I guess I have to marry Ruth. Oh, that's such a, how unfortunate for me. When we know in reality, that's what he wants, right? He wants Ruth, Ruth wants Boaz. So in the end, they get this sort of fairy tale ending, right? It would come about through somewhat deceptive means, but they both end up getting what they want. And Naomi just sort of fades into the distance, right? They get to ride off into the sunset together. Naomi can just stay and wither away, being, whatever. And everybody wins, right? Everybody's happy, right? Boaz gets Ruth, Ruth gets cared for, and Naomi can be left alone to whatever, her fate. Everyone's happy, right? I'm getting any interaction with you guys. No, someone obviously isn't very happy with this. Ruth's not happy with this. This isn't what Ruth wants. And up to this point, Ruth's been fairly passive. She married whichever one of Elimelech's sons. The son died. She's now followed along behind Naomi. She's been taking care of Naomi. But at this point, we haven't really found out what it is exactly that Ruth wants from the situation. What is she expecting? What is she hoping for? She hasn't really made her intentions known. We've heard a lot from Naomi. We've heard a lot from Boaz, but Ruth's been pretty silent. And we're actually... there are two main points in the story where Ruth actually speaks. The first is when she professes her devotion to Naomi, right? Wherever you go, I will go. The second is when we get her interacting with Boaz, which is really interesting. Again, there are only really two places where Ruth speaks, and both are very telling about just not only the story, but also her as a character. But we get probably the most problematic verse in this chapter, where Ruth says, I will do everything that you say. Now, the reason why this is problematic is if Naomi has unveiled her plan, and her plan is basically for Ruth to seduce Boaz, which seems to be what her plan is, right? And Ruth says, I will do what you say, then it seems like Ruth's plan also is to go along with the seducing Boaz thing. And like, oh no, this is how we feel about that. But let's be really clear about what exactly Naomi says, right? Because it says, I'll do what you said to do. So she said to wash, she said to put on perfume and nice clothes, she said to go find him, without making yourself known, and then you got to sneak into his sleeping area. She doesn't actually spell out what happens after that. So there is, and also an interesting kind of theme in this chapters 3 and chapter 4 is discerning the spirit of a law versus the letter of a law. And I think what we're going to find about Ruth is she's going to follow what Naomi said literally, but not necessarily go through with what Naomi may have implied. So in the next verse, it says, she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law instructed of her. Again, this is like, oh no, if Naomi told her to do all these things leading to her basically seducing Boaz, then it sounds like that's what she's going to do. So in 3:7, it says, after Boaz ate, drank, and was in good spirits. I don't know exactly what your translation has. Literally, it's his heart was glad. I think different translations have it slightly different ways. There's a pretty wide agreement that this means he was drunk, which means Boaz wasn't a Baptist. So we know that Boaz is celebrating the end of the harvest, right? That's why he's out winnowing the grain. And what probably was happening, right, is he's out celebrating with all the workers. Boaz is an older guy, and he doesn't party like he used to. So, he's a good boss, he's a good manager, and he's out having drinks with the lads. And he can't hold it anymore. So he goes to his tent or sleeping area or whatever and passes out. This already seems to be a bit of a wrench in Naomi's plan, right? Naomi's plan doesn't seem to account for Boaz being drunk. Maybe it did, I don't know, it doesn't say. So the rest of the verse, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley, probably because he was drunk. So then Ruth goes to his tent where she finds the love of her life drunk in the tent. L'Amour, right? That's the man she wants to marry. So she lays down in secret and does uncover his feet. Again, he's drunk, and it seems like he's already passed out. So at this point, what could they have done? I mean, it seems like her options are kind of limited at this point. I think some people try to interpret that she uncovered his feet maybe to sober him up, maybe to wake him up, maybe to get his attention again in one of those ways, but the fact is he's drunk and passed out. And she's just kind of stuck with him out cold in the tent. So at some point during this evening, she also falls asleep, right? And then in 3:8, it might be one of the funniest verses in the Bible. So around midnight, so the middle of the night, Boaz was startled. And there are weird interpretations about this. I don't necessarily think we need to read too much into it. Again, I take this pretty literally and pretty simply, right? Boaz was out partying with the guys because it's the end of the harvest, and they're all celebrating, and they want their boss to celebrate with them. And so Boaz was drinking. He's an old guy, and he couldn't handle his liquor as well as he used to, and he didn't realize he was drinking so much, and he got sloshed. He went back to his tent where he passed out. Ruth sneaks into his tent, finds him out cold, doesn't know what to do, and she falls asleep. I mean, this almost is like a bad rom-com. So at some point in the night, Boaz, he turns over, and in the Hebrew it's just hilarious, because in the Hebrew it's kind of broken up where it's, he's startled, he turns over, and there lying woman. And the Hebrew is very funny. It's like it seems like it's written intentionally for humor. So then in 3:9, so he then asks, "Who are you?" Implying that he didn't know she was there before. Again, if something had happened, it seems like he wouldn't be asking, "Who are you?" Or otherwise, that's a completely different kind of story. And she then says, "I am Ruth, your slave." She replied, "Spread your cloak over me, for you are a family redeemer." This is pretty much all that Ruth says. But it seems like this is enough for Boaz to figure out what it is she wants and what her intentions are. So she identifies as, "I am Ruth," right? And she uses the same word she had used earlier, "I am your slave, I'm your servant." And then she says, "Spread your cloak over me." Now this is fairly established language. We see this in various places of the Old Testament. This is a general term for protection, right? It's used of your cloak, your wings. You But it's also used in marriage context, right? For the man to spread his cloak over the woman implies protection in a marriage sense. So this is pretty universally accepted as her making an advancement saying, I want to get married to you. I don't have any problem with that. I think that's probably a decent way of interpreting it. But then she immediately connects it for you are a family redeemer or a kinsman redeemer. There's a lot to unpack here because, again, this is all we get from what she says. But it seems like Boaz is fully capable of understanding what her intentions are. So she makes it clear she wants to marry Boaz. And so we back up. Naomi's plan, right, was for her to sneak into the tent and then more or less seduce Boaz and then either guilt him or pressure him into marrying her, and then they get to ride off into the sunset and be, a happy couple. But that's not what Ruth does. There doesn't seem to be any impression of her seducing him. In fact, she waits for him to wake up, and then she has a very calm and rational conversation with him, basically saying up front, I want to marry you. But then she goes, the reason why I want to marry you is because you're the kinsman redeemer. So there's a tie. She's tying the fact that she wants to marry him, and she's pretty sure that he wants to marry her, with he has family obligations. So if you want to get married, you have to fulfill your role as the kinsman redeemer. But whose redeemer is he, right? He's not Ruth's redeemer, because they're not related. He's Naomi's redeemer. So she's saying, if we're going to get married, you have to fulfill your obligations, meaning you have to take care of Naomi. So this puts Boaz on the spot, right? And because, as far as I know, most guys, if they're told up front, hey, let's get married, but mom has to move in with us, I think most guys would be a little uncomfortable with that or not necessarily gung-ho about it. But Boaz seems to have anticipated this, or at least not all that fazed by it. So in 3:10, he says, then he said, may the Lord bless you, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. I think this is a really interesting verse. And again, I think that this confirms that Ruth did not sneak into the tent to seduce him, whether or not that was Naomi's plan, which it seems like it was. And I think that she gave Naomi the intention or the impression that she was going to do that, maybe to set Naomi at ease. But it seems like she hasn't fully told Naomi her plan, which is she wants to marry Boaz, and she wants Boaz to take care of Naomi. And now Boaz has confirmation that's what Ruth wants. And he then blesses her. He's like, this is really admirable. If Ruth had come in, right, snuck in, and then tried to seduce him, speaking as a guy, I think most guys would not be very prone to praising a woman for that. If she comes in, she seduces him, and then tries to guilt him into marriage or guilt him into helping them, most guys aren't going to be very keen on being praising of that. But then he goes, you've shown kindness, right? And I think this is really interesting because this seems to also confirm that, yes, Ruth is younger, yes, Ruth is very beautiful, because if all that Ruth wanted was her own comfort, if all that Ruth wanted was an easier life, which is what Naomi seems to want for her, right? Get away from me, abandon me, and go off and have your own life, live your own life, then Boaz seems to be saying, you could have had that. Right? You could have found some other guy. You could have found some younger guy or even a richer guy to take you in. They would have taken care of you. They would have provided for you. They may have even given you kids. But they wouldn't have taken care of Naomi. Right? To do that would have been to abandon Naomi. And she wasn't going to do that because she wants to care for Naomi. She wants to protect Naomi. And she has waited all this time to find someone who not only wants her, but is also in the position to take care of Naomi, and who would be willing to do that, which is why she's bided her time for Boaz. And Boaz now seems to be getting the bigger picture. So then 3:11. Don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people in town know that you are a woman of noble character. And again, I am not very happy with the translation. Because we lose a lot of the force of what he just said. He says, you are the Eshet Hayil. The Holman, as well as the NIV, says a noble woman. The ESV says a worthy woman. The NASB says woman of excellence. But the King James says the virtuous woman. This is the same phrase that's used in Proverbs 31. Almost like Proverbs 31 and Ruth are meant to be read together, like I suggested a few weeks ago. So we have all that buildup, right? In Proverbs 31, we're told, who can find this woman? And what is she like? And all this stuff. And people are, commentaries are like, oh, who could live up to this? And what would this look like? How would this play out practically? And Boaz literally tells us in Ruth 3, you are the virtuous woman. So the question, right? Who can find a virtuous woman? Well, the answer is Boaz did. He found her. But it's not just that Boaz found the virtuous woman, who is Ruth. If we remember, Boaz was introduced in chapter 2 also as a Hayil. Boaz is a virtuous man, that he also lives up to those expectations. It's like the text is telling us that these two people are quite literally made for each other. They deserve each other in the best possible sense. She's a virtuous woman, and he's a virtuous man, and they have found each other, and they are in love. This pretty much is the best love story in the Bible, in my opinion, and for good reason. Now, as a slight aside, because of how sexually charged this story is, it's fun to mention and also to kind of confirm why I'm not sure that it plays out quite like some people want to say it is. Ruth is one of the 4 women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. Right? We have Tamar, we have Rahab, Ruth, and then the wife of Uriah. And there's some debate over what is it that combines these 4 women. I mean, to me, it's rather obvious. They're all accused of being in some sort of sexual indiscretion. I can't imagine for the life of me why it'd be important for Matthew to call out specific women in Jesus' life who were all involved in some sort of, at least being accused of sexual impropriety. I'm sure there must be some legitimate reason to connect that to Jesus, but it escapes me. I'm being coy, right? Mary was pregnant out of wedlock. That's why he's doing it. So, of the 4, right, Tamar pretended to be a prostitute. Rahab was actually a prostitute. Ruth, at least it appears to be that she has an affair with Boaz, whereas Bathsheba actually does have an affair with Boaz. Something that stuck out to me about this, though, is 2 things. First, there seems to be an alternation, right? Tamar pretended she wasn't actually a prostitute, whereas Rahab was a prostitute. Ruth, as we've gone through the chapter, while it's very heavily implied, and it seems like Naomi is setting her up to seduce Boaz, it seems like if we read it very carefully and we take it fairly literally, she doesn't actually do anything. Like, she uses the occasion to talk to Boaz and to make it clear that she wants to be with Boaz, but they don't actually do anything. So I don't think they actually have an affair. Whereas David and Bathsheba do have an affair. So you have an alternation between pretending, not actually going through with it, with those who actually do. Not only that, but the first 3, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, are all vindicated, right? They are all declared righteous. Even Rahab is declared righteous because she helps the spies and she expresses her faith in Yahweh. The only one who isn't explicitly vindicated in the story is Bathsheba, which might be why she's not actually named, why she's just identified as the wife. So again, I take this all as confirmation. I don't think that they actually had the affair. So then in 3:12, right? So everything now seems to be set up pretty well, right? So Ruth has expressed her interest in Boaz. Boaz has confirmed his interest in her. And she said, I'm prepared to be with you as long as you'll take over as kinsman redeemer. But then we get a problem, right? In verse 12, he goes, yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but, that's always a dangerous word you don't want to hear, there is a redeemer closer than I. This gets into, we just don't fully know what the problem is. According to Jewish tradition, you have Nashon, and Elimelech, according to tradition, is the son of Nashon. We know, according to the genealogies, Salmon is also Nashon's son. So according to Jewish tradition, Elimelech and Salmon are brothers. And Boaz, of course, is the son of Salmon, which means that Boaz is the nephew of Elimelech. But, as we are just told, there's someone closer, someone who actually has the responsibility. And that person is Poloni Almoni. If his name is funny, there's a reason why it sounds funny. I'm not entirely convinced of this because this makes Boaz seem to be pretty young. This makes him of the next generation. And as we've had hinted at, Boaz is an older guy. This is hinted at multiple times. He keeps referring to Ruth as his daughter, which I would think implies that he's a little older. He's hinted at, you could have gone after younger men. He isn't working in the fields anymore, which suggests that he's kind of retired from working in the fields. He's more of a manager. Even from going with the Isaac story, right? When Rebecca shows up and she sees the men working in the field, there's Isaac, who's Abraham's son. He's working in the field along with the men. So just because he owns the field or whatever doesn't mean he wouldn't be helping. So I'm more inclined to think of it something like this. So we don't know who Elimelech's father is, but Elimelech is... I take it that Elimelech and Boaz are cousins. So there's an ancestor that we're missing, right? Elimelech's father and Salmon were brothers. And Elimelech and Boaz are cousins, right? So they're close enough in relation that Boaz can take over. The problem, though, is there's someone of closer relation. And that person is Poloni Almoni. So because there's a brother, because there's someone who is closer in relation, they have dibs, so to say. So it's up to them to step in. Now, again, I think that this also tells us a bit about Boaz. So a lot of the story, I think, is implied. Again, we're going with the innuendo. Stuff's implied without actually being stated. It seems to me that Boaz is fully aware of Naomi's situation. We find this in chapter 2, right? When he comes in from town, he's looking in the field, like, who's that woman? And the worker's like, oh, that's the girl living with Naomi. It seems like he's already looked into the fact that Naomi's back in town. He already knows that Elimelech is dead. He knows that his cousins are also dead. He knows that Naomi is living with the girl. He just doesn't know who she is. That's why he doesn't recognize Ruth. And here, she's like, hey, I want you to play the role of kinsman redeemer. And he's like, I can't. Which sounds like he's already looked into it. Which, if he's already looked into it, before Ruth ever made her intentions clear, it seems to confirm that he really is concerned about Naomi. Because he was looking into Naomi's situation before he knew that Ruth was available, that Ruth was interested in marrying him. Because in the end, Boaz is actually an honorable person who does care about others. Then in 13, it says, stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that's good, let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lie down until morning. So he's making it clear that he's going to press this as a legal issue, right? He's going to make it clear that he either, whoever this relative is, this Poloni guy, that either he will take his responsibility and look after Naomi, in which case Ruth may marry him or they'll have to figure something else out, or if he won't do it, then Boaz will take over as kinsman redeemer, in which case Ruth is all too happy to marry Boaz. So verse 14, she lay down at his feet until morning, but got up while it was still dark. Boaz said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. I mean, obviously this would cause a bit of a scandal, right? If it's known that Ruth is sneaking into old guy's tent in the middle of the night, people would think less of her. There would be rumors spreading about Boaz and so on. So verse 15, he told Ruth, bring the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. When she held it out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into town. We have no idea what 6 measures mean. It's just 6 measures is what it sounds like. There are various theories. There's one theory that says it would be about 300 pounds, which seems like that's more than you'd be able to carry in your shawl. The common theory, the one that's sort of the most common, is that this would be about 60 pounds, which also seems like a lot to carry in your shawl. But we just don't know, because it doesn't actually give us what form of measurement, other than it's just 6 measurements of something. But he doesn't send her away empty-handed. And because, again, this chapter, we've sort of blended marriage language, marriage imagery with the seduction imagery in a way that's possibly to keep us on our toes, again, because to keep the chapter somewhat ambiguous. This could very easily be seen as a bridal payment, right? She's already made it clear that she's interested in him. He's already made it clear that he's willing to marry her, as well as take care of Naomi. And if it is 60 pounds or whatever, which seems like it'd be a lot and worth quite a bit, this may be interpreted as him saying, this is basically what I'm willing to pay to marry you. Like, this is my bridal price for you. So in verse 16, she went to her mother-in-law, Naomi, who asked her, "How did it go, my daughter?" Which is, when you think about it, is really, really funny, especially if we interpret it as when Ruth left Naomi, she in her mind thought Ruth was basically going to seduce Boaz. And she may be wondering, why are you back? Why aren't you still with Boaz? She may have assumed that she might never see Ruth again, right? They go off, get hitched, get eloped or whatever, and Ruth never looks back, right? And Naomi is just left to wallow in her misery. So here comes Ruth wandering back, and Naomi may think, oh no, it didn't go over very well. Maybe he turned her down. Maybe he took advantage of her and still threw her out. Who knows what could have happened? And then Ruth told her everything the man had done for her. I imagine Naomi was pretty shocked when Ruth finally told her what happened and what her plan was. And of course, not only that, but she has this, her shawl just overflowing with food. I guess it was just whatever. She said, "He gave me these 6 measurements of barley because he said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Naomi said, "My daughter, wait until you find out how things go, for he won't rest until he resolves this today." So Naomi realizes that Boaz is serious. He's serious about taking care of Ruth. He's serious about taking care of Naomi. And we get a sense of the urgency. Like Naomi says, this is going to be settled today. He is not, basically the sun's not going to go down before he has an answer one way or the other, which is a really great cliffhanger, right? Unless, of course, you've read the chapter and you already know what's going to happen. But that's pretty much it for chapter 3.
Well, let's pray and then we'll close. Father, we thank you for tonight, for the word. God, how it feeds us and nourishes us. Thank you, Brother James. Pray your blessings upon him. And Father, continue to be with us throughout this week and be with those, Lord, that we're praying for, that they would be strengthened and helped and healed. Lord, we pray in Jesus' name.